The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Policy and Government Oversight Committee will now begin.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Jenkins, and I am the chair of the Policy and Government Oversight Committee. I will call the first official meeting of this committee to order for our regular committee meeting Wednesday, September 16th. And I would also note that this, for the record, that this meeting has remote participation by council members and city staff as authorized under the Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared state of emergency. Due to the declared state of local public health emergency. So at this time, I will ask the clerk to call the roll to verify the presence of a quorum.
Councilmember Rake. Councilmember Rake. Gordon.
Here.
Fletcher. Fletcher. Cunningham.
Present.
Osmond.
Here.
Goodman.
Present.
Kano.
Here.
Bender.
Here.
Schrader.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Palmisano.
Present.
Ellison.
Present.
Chair Jenkins.
Here.
There are 11 members present.
Let the record reflect that we do have a quorum and that Council Member Fletcher is also in attendance. So clerk, please note that. Colleagues, today we have 13 items on the agenda. We will start with the consent agenda, which is items 1 through 11. Item number 1 is the increase in salary schedules to meet the state's gender pay equity salary range test. Items number 2 through 8 include a bid and several contract amendments related to the public service building project. Item number 9 is the acceptance of a grant from Hennepin County for CARES Act funding to be distributed for 2020 elections. And number 10 is the authorization of several contracts for 2018, 2019, and 2020 housing opportunities for persons living with AIDS or HOPWA funding. Item number 11 is the authorization of a grant application to the Center for Tech and Civic Life for the 2020 presidential election. Would any of my colleagues like to pull any of these items from today's consent agenda? Council Member Ellison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't want to pull any of the items, but I did want to just give a shout out to items 9 and 11. Both pertain to the elections team. One is the reimbursement, and just wanted to thank the elections team for all the amazing work that they do. And then the other is for an application. And while I know we don't want to sort of count our chickens before they hatch, as they say, I'm really excited about this work and our ability to conduct elections safely, and just wanted to highlight the awesome work that the election team is doing in pursuing that funding and in ensuring that our elections are safe. So that's all.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellison. I echo those sentiments. Are there any other comments or council members who would like to pull any of these items? Seeing none, I will then move approval of the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Is there any discussion? Seeing none, will the clerk go ahead and call the roll?
Councilmember Rake. Gordon.
Aye.
Fletcher. Fletcher.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Osmond.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Kano.
Aye.
Bender.
Aye.
Bender. Schrader.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Vice Chair Ellison.
Aye.
Chair Jenkins.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
So that item carries and the consent agenda is approved. Our next item for discussion is number 12, which relates to a lease with the Lothenbach Properties and Imagine Express for the use of 2633 Minnehaha Avenue as the 3rd Precinct temporary site. This item has been discussed at our August 20th meeting, but at the August 28th meeting of the City Council was referred back for further work to both this body and the Public Health and Safety Committee. The Public Health and Safety Committee discussed this item at its meeting last week and recommended denial of the lease agreement. And there have been some additional developments since then related to this item. And I would ask our clerk, Mr. Carl, to provide a brief update and a recommended motion. Mr. Carl?
Thank you, Madam Vice President. This is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as clerk for the City of Minneapolis. I was contacted very late last night by the staff team working on this project, and they informed me that the ongoing negotiations between the city and Imagine Express for the lease agreement pertaining to this property, that's property located at 2633 Minnehaha Avenue, have reached an impasse. And so as a consequence, the city and Imagine Express have very amicably agreed to cease further negotiations moving forward. This particular lease agreement was referred, as you noted, Madam Vice President, by the Council to both its Public Health and Safety Committee, as well as the Policy and Government Oversight Committees. Given the fact that there is mutual agreement between the parties to not pursue further negotiation on the proposal, staff is then recommending that this committee forward its recommendation to delete this matter from the agenda so that formal action can be taken by City Council at its meeting on Friday this week, essentially bookending this proposal.
That is quite a development. Well, based on your recommendation, Mr. Carl, I will go ahead and move to delete this item from the agenda. Is there any discussion? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I'm wondering if staff could help fill in for us what the next steps are here, because we have been told that officers currently working and servicing the area of the 3rd Precinct have been working out of the convention center, and that really has a time certain expiration on it in the new year with the convention center uses. I know staff had looked at, I believe, 26 properties or more, and then selected and recommended this site for a lease. And so, are there other properties that were looked at of the 26 that would be candidates? Are staff planning on starting from scratch? How soon might we hear something on this? Any of those kind of details I think would really be helpful. And then I also understand that Councilmember Gordon was working on conditions related to this lease that could really get at community needs and benefits and concerns, and also help move forward some of the transforming public safety work that we're looking at. And so hopefully this is an opportunity as we're looking at other sites to keep that in mind and look at opportunities on how we can advance that work as well through this touch point with the council.
Madam Vice President, this is Casey. I believe that Mr. Ruff, our city coordinator, is also part of the meeting, and I know he can speak in more detail to some of those questions. So I would defer to Mr. Ruff on any further response back to the council on this particular issue.
Absolutely, and thank you, Councilmember Johnson, for that inquiry. And Mr. Ruff, can you elaborate?
Sure, Council Vice President and members of the City Council. I'm Mark Ruff, the City Coordinator. I think number one, when we originally had the vote and referred back to committee, we did identify this as a risk that we could not assure that the owner and the city would continue discussions. We did our best, and I know the owner did their best too, and have nothing but respect for the owner through this process. We do not have an alternative site, and as Councilmember Johnson referred to, time is of the essence, and so we will likely go back to the list of properties that we had contacted previously, and as we had discussed in committee, we may need to go look at properties that are outside even the boundaries of the precinct at this stage. We certainly have heard the council's suggestions about breaking this into smaller pieces or several properties. You know, that does complicate this, and the likelihood of being able to find 2 or 3 or 4 properties, whatever the council was thinking about, in a short period of time for really a temporary location. I just want to emphasize this. This was not a permanent location site. This was a holding place as the council and the mayor evaluate the future of public safety. So we will do our best and certainly take into account Councilmember Johnson's and Councilmember Gordon's conditions as a part of this, but I guess we will also have to depend on what the ultimate selection is, what the term is, and how that fits into the overall city needs for this kind of piece of property.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. I know you complimented the property owners for their forthrightness in negotiating. I'm just wondering, do you know why they may have pulled out of negotiations?
Council Vice President, I don't presume to understand exactly their motivation other than what I referred to earlier, which was we asked them to hang on to this property for a long period of time while we evaluated it, and so that, as I said, that was a risk that we identified a few weeks ago. We did our best, and I know the owner did their best as well. But I think every piece of real estate has different issues, whether that be the term of the lease or insurance provisions or costs or capital improvements, and so every real estate situation is going to be a different one, and different owners have different interests, and that's part of the negotiation process.
Thank you very much. Is there other discussion or questions?
Council Vice President, Councilmember Johnson here. So I appreciate that explanation of next steps around this. I certainly hope we can find a temporary location that can work sooner than later for our city employees. I don't see that as something that's optional, providing a workspace for our city employees who are out there. It's temporary workspace. They are continuing to respond to 911 calls and service the area, and I don't see any of that as being in conflict with our larger public safety work. And in fact, I see the opportunity of approving a lease with conditions as an opportunity to advance that work. This council has such few opportunities around that, given our current authority under the city charter. One is certainly during the budget process, but really this represents a critical moment as well in that regard. So I was hopeful that today we would be able to move something forward with some really nation-leading conditions as well, that were smart goals, that were achievable, and that would really advance that work. So this certainly, I think, is a setback, but we have these city employees that continue to be out there serving the community, and we have to provide them a workspace. And so, you know, I really hope we can find something that can work. I'm glad to hear that you're listening to council on some of these alternative options, such as leveraging substations, so we're not so centralized, things like that. And again, I don't think any of this is in conflict with the larger discussions around our public safety system, or even things that I think that this council and the mayor should look at, such as looking at the size of the precincts and number of them. And we know the 3rd precinct geographically is the largest in the city. It serves a ton of residents. You know, does it make sense to have it continue to be one precinct? Should it be split up? You know, how does that work with the alternative safety responses as well that we're pursuing? Things like that. And those are larger conversations. Certainly, I don't think that those are things we should miss out on. We have to have those conversations, but we also have a more immediate need around space that we need to be paying attention to as well.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Seeing there's no other discussion, I will ask clerk to call the roll on this motion.
Councilmember Wright. Gordon.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Osmond.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Kamo.
Aye.
Bender.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Vice Chair Ellison.
Aye.
Chair Jenkins.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That item carries, and that motion has been approved. So this committee's recommendation will be forwarded to Friday City Council meeting for final action. Our last item on the agenda, item number 13, is a report on air pollution in the city of Minneapolis. We have staff from the Minneapolis Pollution Control Agency on hand to provide us with this presentation. We'll start with the city of Minneapolis own Patrick Hanlon of the city's health department. Mr. Hanlon?
Chair Jenkins, Vice Chair Ellison, council members. My name is Patrick Hanlon. I'm the Director of Environmental Programs in the Health Department. We're presenting on air quality today. Just to give you a little context, there's a lot of concern from council offices, many of you here, and community regarding air quality when the pandemic started, mainly around the economic shutdown. Then a couple weeks into the pandemic, there were some studies that came out that appeared to show a correlation between poor air quality and COVID-19, the spread of COVID-19. And of course, our areas of environmental justice are hit the hardest by poor air quality. So we wanted to bring together, we started meetings with the Minnesota Department of Health and with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency about presenting to council in May. Unfortunately, due to the unrest from the murder of George Floyd, we've had to delay that. So thank you for your patience. I want to thank those from Minnesota Department of Health and Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for their patience as well in bringing this all together. Today, you're going to be hearing from Jim Kelly, manager at the Minnesota Department of Health, Environmental Surveillance and Assessment, Jose Luis Villasenor, the NPCA EJ staff, and a local EJ advocate as well. Greta Gauthier, Assistant Commissioner, Legislative Intergovernment Relations, and Carrie Palmer, Air Assessment Manager. So they've brought some great experts to talk about air quality from a state level, and then also looking at our local air pollution here. They also have on hand several of their staff, should we have technical questions for them afterwards. I know they have this all timed out. So I was thinking that we'd let them get through their presentation and then ask questions afterwards. Of course, if there's some clarifying questions in the middle, this is your show. I think with no further ado, we'll start out with Jim Kelly from the Minnesota Department of Health to get us started.
Thank you, Patrick. And I am really glad that this presentation is finally coming before us. Thank you for your efforts in putting this together. And Mr. Kelly, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, council members. As Patrick said, I'm Jim Kelly. I'm a manager in the Environmental Health Division at the Minnesota Department of Health. And I'm just going to talk to you briefly about some of the connections that have been made between air pollution and adverse health outcomes, and how that is also could be associated with COVID-19. So if I could have the next slide, please. The connections between air pollution and adverse health outcomes have long been established. Most recently, the MPCA, who you'll be hearing from in a little bit, and our department published 2 reports actually called Life and Breath, one that focused on the Twin Cities metro area and one that was statewide. The most recent one that we conducted in 2013 looked at data from the year 2013, showed that between 5 and 10% of all residents who died and 1 to 5% of all residents who visited the hospital or emergency room for heart and lung problems did so partly because of fine particles in the air or ground level ozone, which are 2 of the most common air contaminants that we find both in the metro and as well as outstate. This equates to roughly 2,000 to 4,000 deaths per year that are contributed to by exposure to air pollution, 500 additional hospital stays, and 800 emergency room visits. The burden of this impact on public health does not fall equally upon all. Seniors, children, people of color, people with pre-existing heart and lung conditions are affected more than others. So it bears a disproportionate burden on those who are least able to deal with the burden of continual exposure to excess amounts of air pollution. Low-income areas with more uninsured people, older populations, they're both most vulnerable to the health impacts of exposure to air pollution. Again, and these connections have been shown in scientific literature for literally decades. So this relationship, as I said, has been fairly well established. We know that it impacts certain populations and certain areas more significantly than others. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, most recently, there have been some connections and some preliminary looking at whether exposure to air pollution could also increase either the spread or contribute to the severity of COVID-19 infection. Earlier this spring, a study was done and released by the Harvard University, the T.C. Chan School of Public Health, that found increases in long-term particulate matter. This is the very fine particulate matter that we see associated with air pollution, was associated with up to an 8% increase in COVID mortality. So that is, long-term exposure to pollutants in air could also make one more susceptible to severe outcomes from COVID-19 infection. From a biological standpoint, this is not unexpected. Anything that contributes or causes inflammation or long-term decrements in how your respiratory system functions, we know can certainly make you more susceptible to severe COVID infection, in the same way that other underlying conditions such as asthma, heart disease, diabetes, and other conditions can also make one susceptible to the more severe effects of COVID-19. So from a biological standpoint, this makes sense. Just in the last few weeks, Emory University in Atlanta issued another kind of preliminary study that showed that COVID death rates could potentially be worsened by exposure, long-term exposure to nitrogen dioxide, another air pollutant that's commonly associated with vehicle emissions. Seem to indicate that could result in higher death rates from COVID-19. So it may be that, and while the statement said that they were shifting the focus from fine particulates to nitrogen dioxides, I think the implication really is that this area of study is very new. I mean, COVID itself is very new, only around 6 months. It's been in the United States. And these connections are really just starting to be investigated. But as I said, the finding of excess air pollution contributing potentially to a higher or more severe impact of COVID-19 is not unexpected from a biological standpoint. And I think a lot more study is going to be needed to really refine what these links are. If I could have the next slide, please. So the takeaways I wanted you to get from this information here today is that both underlying health conditions and structural inequities, the policies, programs, decision-making, governments, and economics influence how health is affected by air pollution. We know it has a disproportionate burden on those who are people of color, who are poor, lower socioeconomic standard, who lack access to health care. That, again, has been very well established. A reduction, what we found in our life and breath report is that even a reduction of 10% in the fine particle pollution levels could prevent up to 500 deaths, 50 hospitalizations, 60 emergency room visits across the state. That would have a significant positive public health impact. This is based on models that link the data, what we know about air pollution, to the public health outcomes. So there is good news here in that further reductions in air pollution will definitely produce benefits in public health. At the same time, long-term exposure, according to these preliminary studies, seems to suggest long-term exposure to air pollution appears to also increase the population's vulnerability to the most severe COVID-19 outcomes. So by extension, reducing air pollution over the long term could also help offset some of the more severe outcomes from COVID-19. The combination of this chronic exposure to both air pollution and infection with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, appears to be more harmful than exposure to either one alone across the US population. So again, when you layer these things on top of one another, it produces most likely a more severe outcome than either one would alone. And again, improvements in air quality can reduce the public health impacts of air pollution and disease. And I think that's really the most important takeaway, is that by continuing to focus on air pollution, not lose sight of it despite everything going on, it could have long-term improvements to the health of our population, as well as improving outcomes potentially from COVID-19. Again, I want to stress this work is very preliminary, but it does seem to make sense from a biologic and a public health standpoint. And we're going to continue to follow this science as it advances to see how and where it can be best applied here in Minnesota and elsewhere. I'm going to stop there and turn the conversation over to my colleagues at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, who will say a little bit more about what we know about air pollution and its occurrence in the Minneapolis area. So I'm going to pause there, but I'll remain on the broadcast and available for questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kelly. I am not sure of the order, but I have Jose Luis Villaseñor in next. Is that the order that you folks?
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me, Council President, council members?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay. So I just want to just really quickly just have my my colleagues from the MPCA to introduce themselves really quick, and then we'll begin our conversation with you all. So just want to ask the staff that will be presenting today to introduce themselves, please.
Sure. Hi, my name is Greta Gothier, and I am an assistant commissioner at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I focus on legislative and intergovernmental relations. Thank you for having us.
And I'm Carrie Palmer. I'm the Air Assessment Manager at the MPCA, and we focus on monitoring, emission inventories, and modeling.
Thank you. I just want to say, Vice President, Council Vice President, council members, thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Jose Luis Villaseñor. My gender pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the Environmental Justice Outreach Coordinator at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency in our Engagement and Environmental Justice Unit. Again, I want to thank you for having us here today. And today we're going to share with you how our staff at the MPCA are working tirelessly to fulfill our agency's mission and protect the environment and human health. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by acknowledging the disproportionate exposure to pollution that Indigenous communities, communities of color, and low-income communities are experiencing. It's something that's not created in a vacuum. As an agency, we are learning and unlearning the ways that our communities neighborhoods, barrios look and function are due to structural racism, redlining, racial covenants, and historical disinvestment of indigenous communities, communities of color, and low-income communities that continue to negatively impact our communities today. Within our presentation that we're going to share with you, we're going to share how we use data to inform communities, develop authentic community engagement strategies, and continue to implement environmental justice within all of our programs at the agency. But I have to stress that we have a lot of work ahead of us, and we cannot do it alone without the council's leadership and also without the voice and action of communities that are directly affected by these environmental inequities. So at this point, I would like to pass it over to Carrie and to walk us through how we use data to monitor air quality and impact.
Thank you. Could I have the next slide, please? So, Madam Chair and council members, today I wanted to share some information of the results that we've seen at air monitors in Minneapolis, particularly in North Minneapolis. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that air pollution comes from many sources, and some are very close to us. For example, traffic, construction equipment, and nearby facility emissions. And others might travel from really long distances. We may actually see emissions from agriculture or even from other cities. And in addition, some pollution is directly emitted from sources, and others are actually formed in the air from other pollutants and can end up traveling long distances. So what we actually measure at a monitor is a complex mixture, and it can come from many sources, both near and far. Have the next slide, please.
Ms. Palmer, before you go on, I'm curious, as you're discussing this, are we recognizing or noticing any impacts from the forest fires that are happening on the West Coast here in Minneapolis?
Madam Chair, right now we are tracking those. We have been lucky enough so far that those concentrations haven't come down to ground level, so we're not seeing them in where we breathe and in our monitors. However, we definitely can see it. I don't know if people have been watching, the sunsets. I was just out last night, and you can see the haze from it, but it's up in the upper atmosphere right now. However, there's always the possibility that it could come down. That's happened in the past, particularly with Canadian wildfires, where we've seen that smoke come down and affect our air here in the Twin Cities.
Thank you.
So as Patrick mentioned, one of the questions has been what effects have we seen on air quality during the pandemic, particularly during the stay-at-home orders, where we had quite a bit less traffic and less activity. And so in this case, I wanted to show what we've seen at some of the Minneapolis locations during the March through June time period when we had the stay-at-home order. And just one moment. And the two pollutants I'm going to focus on are the two that Jim Kelly also mentioned, the nitrogen dioxide and fine particles. And again, fine particles are those very tiny particles. They're even smaller than the width of a human hair. But they still, even though they can't be seen, they can cause serious health effects when we breathe them. So looking at those two pollutants, for nitrogen dioxide, we actually saw a decrease of about 20% in 2020 compared to that same time frame in 2019. And that's probably traffic. Cars and trucks are a major source of nitrogen dioxide. So we think a lot of that was due to the reduction in traffic that we saw during that time period. Now, on those fine particles, it was much more mixed. We have one monitoring location that's actually at the 9435W intersection, and there we did see a decrease again of about 20%, and that we're attributing likely to that reduction in traffic as well. However, we have another monitoring site in the Phillips neighborhood on the Anderson School, and that was actually up about 25% in that March to June timeframe as compared to the same in 2019. So it's kind of been mixed for the fine particles, and we don't have a definitive answer on why it increased in the Phillips neighborhood. Can I have the next slide, please? We've also had some questions just in general about what we've seen in air quality over time in North Minneapolis, particularly as the Northern Metal Shredder both shut down and decreased its operations. And this is a little bit more complex slide, but I wanted to just show you some of the monitoring sites that we have and what we've seen since we started monitoring there. We actually have 3 monitoring locations that are permanent in that area. Two of them are very near the Northern Metals location. One is on Pacific Street, the other is on Lowry Avenue. And those monitoring locations started in 2015. We also added an additional site in 2017 across the river in the Marshall Terrace Bottineau neighborhood. And we wanted to see, because there were 3 types of pollutants that we were seeing elevated in North Minneapolis, and they were including larger particles. So those are particles that are quite a bit bigger than those fine particles we discussed, but are still suspended in the air. Coarse particles, those are also very tiny particles, but slightly larger than the fine particles we discussed, and also metals. And in this case, I'm focusing on lead because obviously that's of particular concern, especially for children in development. So we saw those elevated in North Minneapolis. We added the Bottineau site because we really wanted to understand how far these higher concentrations were traveling. And kind of the 2 take-homes from these graphs. One is that we have seen a reduction since 2015 at all of these locations. And some of those have tracked some of the changes that we saw at North Minneapolis or at Northern Metals. For example, in 2016, there was a partial shutdown of operations at the site, and that included ceasing to operate the metals recovery plant. And then the entire facility moved the shredder was closed and moved in late 2019. And where you see that line in the graph, that's where the Northern Metal shredder actually shut down, to kind of see where that location. So we have definitely seen reductions, and particularly some pretty steep reductions in lead, which we're really glad to see. The other take home is that we did see significantly lower concentrations at that Bottineau Marshall Terrace site. So we know that the concentrations are going down pretty rapidly. We think they're on larger particles, and those larger particles are settling out pretty quickly. May I have the next slide, please? The last slide I wanted to share is, again, talking about emissions. And this slide is showing, this is statewide emissions, and it's showing the decreases that we've seen since 2008, and we've seen even more dramatic decreases since the Clean Air Act was enacted before that time. And we've seen decreases particularly in some major sources, including industrial facilities that we permit, in vehicles, cars and trucks that are on the road, off-road equipment, and that includes construction, agriculture, yard equipment. And we've seen lower reductions in neighborhood sources, and those might be like smaller, dry cleaners, auto shops, and then home heating. But we also want to acknowledge that while we've seen these statewide reductions, it doesn't mean that these reductions have been equitable or that everyone has benefited from them. So along with looking statewide, we've made a commitment to look at pollution levels and emissions at a finer scale and to try to better understand what's happening in individual communities and neighborhoods. And I'm going to turn the presentation over back to Jose Luis to talk about what we've learned by looking at a finer scale and what we're trying to do to achieve healthier air for all.
Madam Chair, members of the City Council, if I can get the next slide, and I apologize, there's a lag on what I'm watching than what I'm hearing. So I apologize on that ahead of time. So this slide here is a very shocking data in this slide. It clearly is showing that in Minnesota, we don't all breathe the same air. If you look at this data closely, 32% of residents in the state of Minnesota are exposed to air pollution. But when you add low-income residents, they are exposed to air pollution at 46%. Communities of color and indigenous communities experience a 91% exposure to air pollution. In the other section of this slide, across the state, 6% of our residents live near a facility we permit in the state of Minnesota. 9% of low-income residents live near a facility we permit, and communities of color at 15% live near facilities that we regulate their emissions. We share this data. To fulfill, to literally say that we are falling short of our low-income indigenous communities of color, and that we are advancing as quickly as we can with community and within the agency our environmental justice strategies that the MPCA as an agency is setting as a priority. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm not sure if I'm... In the next slide, and how we are doing this, we are monitoring air quality. We are enforcing the law and regulation and regulating pollution sources. In areas that we directly do not regulate, such as car pollution and small businesses, we are working with the public and businesses to prevent air pollution. Next slide. We're also doing this with special projects, community engagement, grants and loans that I will further explain in the next slide.
The slide is up.
Next one.
It's up.
I apologize. Next slide. I see this one. Next one. Perfect. One example, with the new administration, the MPCA has increased its work to assess air quality in Minneapolis and St. Paul, installing the best technologies in communities throughout St. Paul and Minneapolis to further understand the air quality in the areas shown in this map. Next slide. In regards to building authentic partnership with community members, we are hosting a 3-day online air permitting engagement workshop for community members, including facilities, neighbors, and Native communities. This month, September 21st through September 23rd. Furthering our priority of authentic partnership, the MPCA has convened an Environmental Justice Advisory Group, a body of community-based environmental justice advisory groups that work closely with the MPCA commissioner and implementing environmental justice within all the agency's programs. At the same time, our commissioner, Laura Bishop, has created a new position, Director of Public Engagement and Tribal Liaison, led by Helen Walkew, that is here today with us. Now I'd like to pass it over to Greta to go over the grants and loans and programs that our agency, as well as the challenges and what more we can do as a state agency in fulfilling our mission. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose Luis. And could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I want to talk a little bit, Madam Chair and members of the committee, about some of the grant programs that we have been directing to address air quality in Minneapolis. We are in the process of distributing money from the Volkswagen settlement. As you may recall, back in 2016, when Volkswagen, the Department of Justice came after Volkswagen for some vehicle tampering with their emissions equipment, and in a settlement of several $1 billion, the state of Minnesota got about $47 million, which we are now distributing. This is going to be about an 8-year process of distributing the money, and we're maybe about a third of the way through. So far, we've awarded $1.5 million, little over $1.5 million in grants to projects in Minneapolis. And these have been able to reduce the amount of pollution in the air, as you can see in the black circle on the screen. These projects have included things like grants to buy new diesel on-road vehicles and electric vehicles or machinery for off-road purposes, and it also has included the installation of some electric vehicle charging stations. Next slide, please. Madam Chair, we also have a small business grant program at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and we have directed about $150,000 for 20 projects in Minneapolis from our small business grants. This includes 14 electric landscaping equipment projects, 4 charging stations, 3 projects to switch wood and metal finishing products to cleaner alternatives, and 1 project to switch a dry cleaner away from perchloroethylene to a safer solvent, more environmentally friendly solvent for their dry cleaning. So this grant program helps small businesses achieve reductions in their emissions. And we have tried to focus this work on Minneapolis, and we'll continue that. Next slide, please. Madam Chair, we have a couple other things that are also impacting air quality in Minneapolis, or that we hope will, and I'm going to go into those just very quickly. Next slide, please. We have a brand new electric school bus pilot program. Here you see our Commissioner, Laura Bishop, and the Commissioner of Transportation, Margaret Anderson Kelleher, announcing this just last month. We are investing from those Volkswagen dollars up to $3 million in to purchase all electric school buses around the state of Minnesota. Of course, these will get older diesel buses off the road for cleaner energy, but more importantly, cleaner air, especially around places where children are. This is very open to urban districts, school districts across the state, and we encourage your school districts in Minneapolis and also the transportation contractors that work with them to apply for this grant. The grant is capped at $275,000, so it will make an impact because these vehicles sometimes are difficult for school districts to afford. Next slide, please. Also, we are undertaking a major change in the rules and regulations at the for the state of Minnesota around clean cars. We are moving forward a change in the state's rules so that Minnesota can join 14 other states in adopting low emission and zero emission vehicle standards. These are the standards that were in place at the federal level, but earlier this year, at the end of March, the Trump administration rescinded those limits. We want to stay with the limits as they were before and provide drivers across the state with access to more electric vehicle options. This will, of course, reduce greenhouse gases because one of the major, well, right now in Minnesota, the major source of greenhouse gases is transportation. Next slide. Also, Madam Chair, another thing we have done recently is that Minnesota became the first state in the country to ban the use of trichloroethylene, which is a solvent, in the state. And this came out of a enforcement that we had at a facility up in White Bear Lake. But starting on June 1 of 2022, no facilities can use trichloroethylene again. And we are working with many facilities across the state to reduce their use and help people get off of using TCE. This includes several businesses in Minneapolis. So we are focusing on community engagement, using our modeling, air modeling and monitoring data, as well as new enforcement actions to bring this ban to fruition. Next slide, please. Madam Chair, as with any unit of government, we have challenges and restrictions upon what we can do. We are a state agency and we are delegated by the federal government to enforce federal environmental laws in Minnesota, and we also enforce and implement state environmental laws. But those laws are not perfect, and so there are things it would help if we could do them, but unfortunately, right now, we cannot. And some of those things are regulating all pollution sources, such as all vehicles, lawn equipment, small machinery, and so forth. We cannot decide where facilities and roads are located, and we cannot, for the facilities that we regulate, if they are meeting state and federal regulatory requirements, we cannot force them to close or to move, as long as they are in compliance with state and federal law. And that is a difficult one for us at the agency. Next slide, please. I wanted to just touch on a couple things we're looking at doing, Madam Chair, and give you a flavor for what's on the horizon for us. We are going to continue all of these efforts, but we want to move beyond that and work more around environmental justice and equity, engaging with communities where we know there is an overburden of pollution, and there has been for many years. We also want to look at other states. The state of Oregon just passed a pretty comprehensive clean air rulemaking. And just a few weeks ago, the state of New Jersey passed probably the landmark environmental justice legislation in the country right now. And so we are taking a look at that as well. But of course, as Jose Luis said, Madam Chair, we can't do it all ourselves. And so we're always interested to work with other governments, communities, citizens, permittees, anyone who is willing to help us in this effort because of the public health impacts and the benefit to the environment. Madam, next slide, please. So, Madam Chair, with that, this concludes our remarks. And I think we would be open to taking any questions that members of your committee or you may have. And thank you again for allowing us to come before the committee today and present this information.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gauthier, and to all of you for this sobering presentation. There are some encouraging factors that were presented, including the awareness about the funds from the Volkswagen settlement that could potentially be used to help projects designed to reduce pollution in Minneapolis and elsewhere around the state. We certainly want to be able to partner on that. The school bus program sounds very encouraging, electric buses for schools. I'm wondering, are there any questions or comments from my colleagues? Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank city staff and thank the state staff for all of their work, especially in these times. Also wanted to, thank them for the work on the school buses. That's something constituents on my ward, worked very hard on promoting. So I'm really excited to see that program going forward.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Schrader. And it appears that there was one last slide that we did not cover, and I'm not sure who wants to speak to that slide.
Yeah, Chair Jenkins, this is Patrick Hanlon again. I just want to close this out with some of the next steps that we're taking. So we'll be meeting with the Northside Green Zones. There was already one meeting where we kind of had this same presentation with the Green Zones in talking about air pollution and what can be done. We'll be having another meeting that's focusing on local solutions in November. And then Greta had mentioned legislative action. I've been really pleased to hear that they have some legislative agendas that they'd like to sit down and talk with us. So we'll be meeting with Jean Ranieri and Fatima Moore to talk about how we can support those legislative actions to be protective of public health, especially in our environmental justice communities. And then having some more of those conversations where we're bringing business and community together. That's going to be one of the focuses, both from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and from ourselves when we're going out and doing community meetings. The community can be a really powerful voice that we don't have in meeting with some of those businesses and really getting those messages across. And then incentivizing change. They mentioned some of the grant programs and the loan programs that they have at the MPCA. With the programs that we've developed here in Minneapolis and through your support through council and the mayor's office, we've been able to fund and incentivize change that wouldn't have otherwise happened. The eliminating of PERC in the dry cleaning process is one of the first victories that we've had in that in that regard. We're looking at what we can do with auto body shops. There's another 50 tons of potential pollution there. And to date, we've worked in industrial, on-road, off-road, and neighborhood projects to reduce 60 tons of pollution in our neighborhoods. And that's equivalent to 1.5 times all the total pollution from Northern Metals. One of the projects that I'm most encouraged about we just funded this year was a clean air repair program, and that's working with low-income members of our community who need car repair. And there's 4 different locations across the metro area, 2 of which are going to be in Minneapolis, the Lift Garage, and then Newgate is going to be doing some improvements as well. And to date, just in a year, that program has already reduced 4 tons of pollution on our roadway, because those are some of the least efficient vehicles producing the most pollution. So these are the efforts that we're taking with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and Minnesota Department of Health to really focus on local solutions and how we can drive forward. And one last thing, I just want to again thank the MPCA and MDH for all of their time coming forward today, and then also like to thank Kelly Molman in facilitating and organizing a lot of this work. She put a ton of work to bring us all together, so thank you, and thank you to the council members. And I'll close with that.
Thank you, Mr. Hanlon. And I will just say I'm really encouraged to see the reduction in pollution, in small particulates in North Minneapolis. It really is encouraging and a testament to the community's engagement and advocacy, as well as city staff and state and agencies all working together to bring about some of those changes. I am discouraged to hear that fine particulates are increasing in the Phillips neighborhood and in South Minneapolis. And we really need to try to figure out what is the challenge that's creating this significant increase. 25% is I would say is relatively significant and deeply concerning. Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a couple of questions. First, I do want to thank staff for this presentation. This is amazing work, and I know that it's been hard work over many, many years. On the Northern Metals front, I am likewise glad to see those reductions. I think it's really important, and absolutely the community advocated and fought to try to eliminate some of the heavy polluters in our community. But I wondered, we're able to see the reduction within the communities that were impacted. But how do we know, how do we know when we're at a level that is on par with what other communities face? I guess I'm interested to know sort of what's at what level do we know that our community members are breathing essentially clean air to the extent that that's possible. Because as we also saw just a few slides later, of the 32 people who are living near these polluting sites, 91% of them are people of color. I believe that's what the graph indicated. And so just wanted to know, how do we know when the levels, even though they are decreasing, how do we know when to celebrate the fact that our communities are breathing clean air? That's my first question. Then I have one more.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Ellison, thank you for that question. I'm going to ask Kari Palmer from our AIR program to speak to that.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Ellison, I would say when we see clean air, because I agree, it still is elevated, particularly at those 2 monitors that are very close to Northern Metals. And probably as people are aware, that's not the only facility in that area either. We know that there's multiple facilities in the area, multiple unpaved roads and dust that comes from those areas. When we look at the sites, we look at the Botno Marshall Terrace site, those concentrations are very similar to what we see in other metro locations. So when we see levels, I would say at that same level that we're seeing at the Botno Marshall Terrace area for these particular pollutants, then we'd be very close to seeing what we see at other sites. So that is what we would do, and that is what we do on an ongoing basis, is compared to what are we seeing at other sites, both in the Twin Cities and throughout Minnesota. Because again, we shouldn't have certain areas that have lower air quality than others. So particularly for lead, that would be an example more of where you would see, we should be seeing metals. And we still are seeing elevated levels at those 2 sites that are near the Northern Metals area.
Thank you so much for that response. That's very informative. Thank you. My second question had to do with the busing program. I've had some community members reach out concerned that there might be barriers given for our Minneapolis public schools being able to access this program, that maybe there are restrictions in the application. I don't know enough about what those restrictions might be. Do we anticipate potential barriers to being able to access this program, or do we think that this is primed for Minneapolis public schools to access?
Madam Chair and Council Member Ellison, thank you for that question. We certainly do not want there to be any barriers for any community to apply for the electric school bus grant program. So as far as I know, we are taking every measure that we can to ensure that there is not a problem. But I would be happy to discuss that with you, or to provide the committee with more information about how to apply for these and timelines, etc. We certainly don't want anyone to face barriers in applying for the funds.
Great. I'll take that follow up offline, and would love to have a few more pointed questions that I can take back to community members. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellison. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the presentation and all the work, and actually the, I think, incredible partnership that we've had with the state in terms of dealing with these issues. I know that particularly getting progress on TCEs really meant a lot in my part of the city. I was a bit intrigued, of course, as a legislator and member of local government when I saw the slide on challenges and what we don't or can't do. And you talked about regulating all pollution sources such as vehicles, lawn equipment, and backyard fires. And we actually, this comes up every so often. There was also the piece about forced facilities to close. And I know in Phillips, there are some industrial uses that are operating on there right now. And I'm just wondering, and even the slide says forced facilities to close or move if they are meeting state and federal requirements. So we're even implying there we could change our requirements and maybe have some different leverage there. I also remember getting a long letter with some articles and information about gas-powered leaf blowers, and people were pushing on us as a city and saying, why can't you do something about this? They're terrible for us. So I'm wondering if any of you experts have any recommendations, if there might be an opportunity to better regulate and push back on some of these sources. And I agree that seeing that increase in Phillips is especially concerning. And we actually can decide here with our zoning rules about where facilities go, and with our decisions on roads, sometimes where they can be located as a government, at least how wide they are maybe, or what uses there are on them. So is there action you wish that city government or state government would take so that we could do a better job of cleaning up the air that we're all breathing?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, that's a big question. You know, I feel we have an excellent working relationship with the city of Minneapolis and have been able to do a lot together, yet of course much work remains. In terms of changing what the MPCA can regulate, unfortunately, or fortunately, that is, the parameters of that are really set by federal law. The United States Congress has not updated the Clean Air Act since 1990, and this is a major issue for us, because think about how technology has changed since 1990. You know, our hands are tied to a degree in that regard, Of course, a state can always have regulations that are more environmentally protective than the federal. And that's, of course, what we're trying to do with our Clean Cars rule. We are making our Minnesota rules more protective than the current rules in the Trump administration. And we have been working with legislators from Minneapolis who have come up with ideas, and we have tried to work on bills that would address specifically communities where there are historical overburden of pollution or environmental justice concerns. Unfortunately, again, we face the same problems that many other governments face. Is we have a divided legislature in Minnesota right now, so it's been difficult to move some of these bills through the entire legislature to get to the governor for signature. But we are ready. We are coming in next year with some more policy proposals that we think will bring to bear fundamental changes. In terms of specific, and we want to work with the city of Minneapolis on those proposals as well. In terms of specific things that the city could do, I guess I would ask Kari if she knows of anything, but I guess I'd prefer to probably get back to you with perhaps some ideas about what some of those could be. Again, we have such a great working relationship with the city that we've already done so many things together, and we are able to have our programs complement each other, so we're not repeating, but we're building on each other. We're not duplicating, I should say. We're building with each other towards our goals. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it does. And also I wanted you maybe just to hear the questions, because I think if it looked like cities were doing things that looked really promising to you, and you were looking for a place to maybe encourage somebody to pilot something innovative, maybe that you couldn't get done on the state level, I think that the people of Minneapolis might be receptive to that. We did create our Green Zones program and legislation to also allow us to focus on certain areas to try innovative things and to try to make a difference. And so I'll say quite honestly, to hear that our Southside Green Zone maybe is actually suffering more than elsewhere means we're not making a lot of progress there as much as we probably should. And I'm sure we could make more on the North Side Green Zone as well. So, and we can have more ideas here. But I also really appreciate that you might want to share some of the more innovative things that might be more challenging offline and outside of this meeting as we kind of delicately tiptoe into increasing regulations somewhere. It's always challenging to try to increase regulations and change behaviors. So I appreciate that too. But if anybody else wants to weigh in a little bit, that's fine with me too. Thanks.
Madam Chair and Representative Gordon, Councilmember Gordon, thank you for that. I will keep in mind your offer to have Minneapolis as a site for a pilot. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you both. And just a little context, we really came up with this concept to provide this presentation when the council. The biggest challenge we were dealing with was COVID-19, and then the subsequent really tragic incidents, which resulted in the loss of George Floyd's life and subsequent unrest, really delayed this presentation. And so I'm grateful that it has come today. And it really has come at a time when I think we have a little more headspace to really wrap our brains around what's being presented today and consider what types of policies and changes and shifts in how we are addressing this issue. It gives us just more insight in this work. Council President Bender.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've been listening with interest, and I know there's a lot of pieces of work
throughout the enterprise that are looking for solutions to these various factors that we can influence. I did want to note that one of those is the Transportation Action Plan, which is underway, which has a direct relationship between our air quality. And I think that's another process and project that has shifted its timeline because of staff capacity related to COVID-19 and George Floyd's murder and the unrest and all the other things happening. But that work is still underway, and I think we are in a time where commuting patterns are shifting and transportation choices are shifting in a lot of ways that are challenging, but also give us a chance to really look at our street system and figure out how we can, as we, eventually, I think, start to reopen, if you will, workspaces start to have employees come back and schools and all those things. We have a little bit of time and space here to figure out how we want to make sure that that happens in a way that supports environmental justice and supports air quality in the right way. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that soon from staff. They've done community engagement. They've heard loud and clear from our community that we want our transportation system to contribute to equity and not contribute to harm. And so just want to highlight that as another piece of this work, along with all the other parts of that health and that we're doing through energy efficiency and through potential regulations of polluters, that is such a big piece of this air quality for our community.
Thank you, Madam President, for that context and for those additional supports that we as the city are implementing to address these issues, and certainly continued partnership with MPCA and Minnesota Department of Health is going to be critical in that work as well as our, in partnership with environmental justice advocates and groups in the city. This issue is becoming more and more urgent every day as we witness the fires along the West Coast, the multiple hurricanes at one time that are formulating up and down the East Coast. We are really approaching beyond a climate crisis and emergency. I'm not quite sure what the right sort of adjective would be to describe the state of our climate is. But suffice to say that we don't have time to continue to sort of trim around the edges. Now is the time for us to take bold steps and bold actions to really address these issues for our low-income communities that are bearing the most impact and brunt of this issue, but beyond for our entire community, because we know that we are all being challenged by this environmental disaster, impending disaster that we're facing, and everything that we can do from the Transportation Action Plan to the solar work and electric cars and installing electric charging stations, etc. All of these things are going to have to be a part of our strategies moving forward. If there are no other comments or questions from my colleagues, I again want to thank the Minneapolis Health Department staff, Mr. Hanlon, Ms. Moman, Kelly Moman, our partners at the MPCA and MDH for coming in and sharing this presentation today. And thank all of you, my colleagues, for being engaged in this discussion. And I will direct the clerk to receive and file that report. And without any objection, we have concluded all business to come before this committee today. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.